Hi, everyone. I'm Summer,
I'm Carrie.
and this is Hopoxia Podcast.
Join us to talk about sex, drugs, and self improvement.
Welcome back. And unfortunately, we are minus Carrie today. She is out sick. But Jessica's joining me so that we can have a conversation about psychopathy, because a lot of people have sent me messages asking me what it's like to parent a child who is, it appears, a psychopath, born with psychopathy. A couple of things I do want to say. She is a minor, but that is not the reason that I restrict what I say or how much of her story I tell. I do that because it's her story to tell, not mine. I try to address only my side of things, like how it affects our family, but still I'm pretty vague on details. I did have somebody try to call me out on TikTok recently, because I made a comment about her practicing emotional mimicry, and they said that I was trying to call her out negatively. I'm like, wait a second, her being born with psychopathy, or the skills that she's learning to try to navigate life, are not inherently negative.
No.
So I do want to put that out there for anybody who watches or listens to this. When we use words like a psychopath, sociopath, all of those things, we are speaking clinically. This is not...
It's not a judgment.
Right. It is not a
Right.
judgment. And part of our goal here at Hypoxia is to eliminate that stigma, because it's not her fault she was born with psychopathy. That is genetic. We all get the DNA lottery, and
That's
this
right.
is just what she has to navigate her life with. And my job as her parent is to try to give her the best environment to grow in and learn to navigate that. And that's what I'm trying to do, because each of our kids are different and we have to tailor our parenting accordingly.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
Jessica, will you kind of give us a little bit of your background,
Sure.
so that the audience knows your experiences?
Yes. So I am a former clinician. I'm what you call an ABD psychologist, so all but dissertation. So I have my master's in applied psychology, and I was going for my PsyD, but did not complete my program. I have lots and lots of working experience that's related to what we call forensic psychology. So that's when you start to kind of merge the criminal aspects with the treatment stuff that you would do for kind of a more general population. I kind of fell into that work. I originally started going into psychology so that I could work with people with disabilities. That was my primary, focus. I ended up doing an externship at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, where I was working at the women's jail ward. So, you know how you have like Rikers Island in New York? For the women who would become too psychotic to be at the psychotic in the psychology ward at Rikers, they were acutely ill enough to require to go to the hospital. So that they had like a very limited ward for women. So I got my first experience working with kind of that overlap of women and women who had committed crimes and women who had psychological disorders. But I also got my very first experience with women with psychopathy. And it's interesting to me now too, because even having worked in like a few different places with different populations at this point, it took like a few years to find a supervisor who was able to give me a broader training and understanding of people with psychopathy, because it wasn't part of like my formative graduate school courses. And I kind of later learned that that's because there's really not a lot of agreement among psychologists about whether this is really a phenomenon. So in some respects, I think people who are dealing with psychopathy are still, and especially like the families of, are still dealing with the trying to get this recognized on a clinical level. So that's its own uphill battle. And it kind of reminds me of like other medical phenomena that have happened with people in the past where they talk about like, hey, I think I have fibromyalgia. And the doctors are like, oh, you mean you're depressed? Like,
Right.
mm-hmm. So I think like there's some resistance to acknowledging psychopathy as a disorder because some clinicians believe that there's no suffering with psychopathy, so we're not going to. There's no suffering for the person
Patient.
with psychopathy, you
Right.
know. So why would we bother like pursuing this as a thing? And the other thing that I mean, my understanding of the most recent formation of the DSM, which is the big Bible of all the particular disorders you can have psychologically, is that the consensus was that clinicians could not properly be trained on how to identify psychopathy with any degree of regularity. So it's still kind of within that little cluster of antisocial personality disorder. I say all that to say it took me a while to find like, and I, as I said, I fell into it. Supervision and people with like genuine expertise that I could learn from. But there is a sort of a family of people who are interested in this kind of work, who go into it and pursue it mainly maybe because they want to be like working at the FBI, or maybe they want to do prison work or whatever, but they do pursue it specifically. But it is not a huge percentage of like the average clinician who has a great fluency with dealing with psychopathy and criminal behaviors in general. So
you mentioned that this is not a diagnosis,
correct.
which I'm not sure that the general public actually understands that.
That's right.
It is not a specific diagnosis any more than sociopath is. They're
Right.
under the umbrella of antisocial personality disorder.
Correct.
And that is interesting that the patient isn't suffering, so there's not the motivation.
That's what I've heard before.
Interesting.
So
how far away, I wonder, are we from having a diagnostic ability? Because what they started doing, like functional MRIs, to I don't know what the word is, but to establish that there is a brain difference
correct.
between psychopaths and the rest of us. What was that? The 80s, 90s?
I mean, I was just kind of brushing up because I have been out of practice for over 10 years. So I'm even behind the times as to what like the science of psychopathy and treatment has evolved to. But you're right. Like the neuroimaging stuff shows really like low activity in the amygdala. I also just want to say too, like, and I know you've said this before, you've talked about where psychopathy kind of fits in with antisocial personality disorder and all that other stuff. So we categorize the one thing that is diagnostic, like you can put a diagnosis on it and it has like a code, right? Is antisocial personality disorder. That is in the DSM. Psychopathy is like the extreme version of that. And it's like a little sliver, like 1% of the antisocial personality disorder. And so it's really just like the more extreme version of that. And there are rubrics and checklists to be able to determine if somebody does have psychopathy. And there are agreed upon terms, definitions, and behaviors that clinicians who work with people with psychopathy do agree on, but it doesn't mean that every psychologist says, oh, yes, this is a valid measure. So like the standard for people who are working with psychopathy is the PCLR, which is the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. And that is by Robert Hare, who has done amazing work with people with psychopathy. And I really recommend, if you're new to the world of looking at psychopathy and want it from like a very like layman's terms, the book Without a Conscience is fantastic. I have a copy here.
I need to read that one.
Yeah, it's very good. It's very like it's scientific. But it's also based on like the collection of his data that he had in terms of like his case experiences with people. The bulk of my experience that I had working with people with psychopathy was working with sex offenders in a civil commitment facility where we happened to have kind of a disproportionate to the regular prison population amount of psychopaths inside. So I got a lot of broad experience.
Another book I like
Mhm.
is The Psychopath Whisperer by Dr.
Yes,
Kent Keel, and he was actually mentored by Dr. Hare. So he's the
yes,
one who started the functional MRI imaging
nice.
on psychopaths, working primarily within the prison system,
Yes,
because
that's where they are.
that is where they are. And he
Yeah.
found out, because he did transition out of prisons at one time and tried to do it in the community, and being able to keep keep your participants coming back and on
Mhm.
track with research, as you have to do, is not as easy when they're not a literal captive
Captive
population.
audience. No, it's
Yeah.
true. And plus the motivation for doing treatment, I think, is different when you have something like a carceral system.
Oh, that's fair.
So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, so it's not, it is definitely has some ethics that I think are appropriate to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, this just happens to be where they are. And so this is where, if you're a clinician that's interested in that, this is where you go,
Mm-hmm. And there's also a website for any of the audience who wants to learn more information. There is an organization called Psychopathy Is, and the website is psychopathyis.org. And
Mhm.
their basic purpose is to try to get psychopathy researched more thoroughly,
Yes.
as an individual identifiable disorder.
They have such great resources on that website. It's very clear and, digestible that you could give somebody if you're a person who is a caregiver or an educator or a clinician, and want to become more of a public advocate, or even just to educate yourself. I think that's an excellent resource.
I have noticed, and that's one thing I hadn't really thought about it too much until I looked at their website, and it does go into depth about how common psychopathy is. Like, it's 1% of the population. And I hear a lot of people who say they don't know any psychopaths, right? And in their head, they picture, the serial killer they saw on TV, right? And I'm like, it's 1% of the population. There are 8 billion people in the world. I'm not good at math, but that's a lot. That's several millions of people.
Yeah.
You statistically, you do know psychopaths.
Right.
You just don't know it. But they're not all violent. They're not all. They're not all Jeffrey Dahmer. They really aren't.
No. I think so. It's really important to conceptualize psychopathy. It's just a very extreme personality disorder. So when we talk about, like, I've always even struggled with the terminology of personality disorder because I feel like it's too stigmatizing. But what we mean when we say personality disorder, there's a way that your personality is built such that it impairs your ability to have relationships and get along in the world. That's what that means. It's not because you're perceiving reality. You're not hearing things and seeing things that other people aren't. You don't have odd beliefs necessarily, but you have this way of interpersonally relating that is really, to a statistical, clinical, significant level, impairing your ability to connect. So whether that's narcissistic personality disorder, borderline, or antisocial, that's where you're having conflict. Psychopathy is kind of the same thing, where it's this very extreme personality disorder, And the other piece is that in terms of how do you know if you've interacted with somebody who, it's like this very complex picture, and all of these little elements have to be in place in order for you to have like a very clear understanding. Yes, this is a person with psychopathy. But often, like you're right, people will just go, oh, I met this really charismatic person, and you'll be like, oh, interesting. And
Mm-hmm.
criminality is not, it's not always necessarily going to be the thing that defines a psychopath. Criminality can be a clue that might need to be examined, but it's not. They're separate domains. And so the thing that I experienced, because my particular area of expertise was working with sex offenders who had intellectual disabilities who were also psychopaths, and I got a lot of pushback from like the support team in the facility where I worked at, who would say like, well, they're too, forgive the word, but retarded to be able to have done XYZ, LMNOP or no, or be able to take responsibility. I'm like, well, first of all, criminality has nothing to do with intellect. You could have a very low intellect or a very high intellect and still commit crimes. And the same is also true with like psychopathy. You could have no psychopathy or high psychopathy, and you might or might not commit crimes. I don't know, but it's going to be like the full constellation of those pieces that is going to give me the proper picture about whether or not somebody has psychopathy. But yeah, they're around for
Right,
sure.
definitely. So can you kind of give us the Cliff's Notes version of the characteristics
Yes,
of
and I'm going to
psychopaths?
refer to my notes because it's large. So,
Yes.
okay. Uh, so, what we've got here is glib and superficial, egocentric and grandiose, a lack of empathy, deceitful and manipulative, shallow emotionality, impulsive, poor behavioral controls, a need for excitement, lack of responsibility, early behavior problems, and lack of remorse. Another thing that we used to see is like a like if there's going to be criminality, it's not necessarily like I'm a bank robber and I'm only a bank robber and I just rob the banks. Like, oh, we've done it all. Like, like you see a lot of like variability within the criminality as well. So those are the hallmarks, but yeah, so those are the hallmarks.
And it mentioned early behavioral. I actually connected with a group of, because for those who aren't aware, when their personality disorders cannot be diagnosed until you're an adult.
That's right.
So the juvenile diagnosis is conduct disorder, which
Yes.
is based on behavior. So not all kids with conduct disorder are psychopaths.
Right.
Well, most psychopaths are going to have some sort of conduct disorder.
That's right.
And anyway, so I posted with them because my daughter, which of course her initial, it's not uncommon for these kids to go through many incorrect diagnoses before we finally get there as they grow, and we can kind of see the pattern. But her original diagnosis was reactive attachment disorder, because a lot of those behaviors at those ages do overlap. And because she was involved in the foster care system, that was just kind of the assumption. But I had seen like she didn't move in with me till she was 5, but we had some contact prior to that because we were already involved with the family. So like when I saw her when she was 2, you could already see the flat affect, the inappropriate familiarity with strangers. She didn't have that age appropriate fear of strangers. And even when she was an infant, my then husband had seen her, when she was a few months old, and she should have been, at that point, babies are interacting with you and kind of playing. She wouldn't do any of that. And her family also reported that she was a good baby. She almost never cried. She didn't have that normal emotional range, right? Which most people associate with, oh, they're good because it's easy, right? But that's
Mm-hmm.
actually a red flag.
Right.
So I posted in the group for asking parents, because I couldn't find any research on this. Like, is this a commonality in children that young? And so anecdotally, most of them, of the ones that have now, which their kids are older adults, or older teenagers or adults now, all said that their kids had the same or similar symptoms
Mm-hmm.
from birth.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we told that?
Yeah, because it's really fuzzy. Like,
Uh-huh.
a lot of these, you could talk about like flat affect being, it could be, that's like the tip of the iceberg for a multitude of things that could be happening with a child.
Right.
So that's really the problem, is that like when you're talking about a personality disorder, you think about, when do you have your fully formed personality? It's not really until adulthood. So like, and when is that?
Right.
Neurologically, those structures are still building and forming for a pretty long time, and so it's really, really tricky. It is absolutely the truth that there are people who have children with psychopathy who are clearly psychopaths from birth. Like, but they're also, a good, I guess the good, like, a good clinician is going to examine really all of those pieces first. And it is going to be like a longer process of a rule out with, reactive attachment would make sense for, a person brought up in the foster care system,
Right.
or somebody who's had, a really traumatic attachment disruption of any kind, um, and then too, like, because it's just the more because this is also just such a small segment of the population, the likelihood that it's going to be this particular zebra,
Right. But
you
why
know.
aren't we told as parents, like, to recognize, or just community members in general, like, to
Hmm.
recognize, okay, so flat affect, for example,
Hmm.
that indicates something, right? It
Yeah.
could be a lot of things, even autism. Some
Hmm.
autistic people have flat affect.
Hmm.
But why are we not taught just to accept that shows something,
Hmm.
and to
Like to follow up and pursue.
deal, right, and to deal with that person in whatever way is appropriate for them, given whatever their specifics are, instead of, so we're going to teach them how to pretend to be happy all the time, which is what happened to her in her family of origin. She was
Yes.
just taught to pretend to be happy.
I mean, I feel like I hear people with autism talking about that in terms
Mhm.
of masking. So
Right.
I think like you're pointing to like a larger question about like ableism in our society and community too. Like,
Hmm.
we expect a certain amount of conformity, and why are we not taught these discernible signs and symptoms of things that might or might not be going on? Why are we not allowed to be attuned? I mean, I feel like these are things that are punishing no matter which direction, because we're not really given support as parents for really very much at all of any kind, like typical or not typical kid.
Hmm.
Like, and I don't think it's possible to even like tell the story, like your story of where you're coming from is, I think it's impossible to tell that story without talking about the lack of resources that it are inherent, and that has been on purpose. It has been, so it's a very isolating experience, like, trying to gain, I want to, if you have a kid who has an issue, you want their treatment to be like the most up-to-date, empirical, effective treatment. Like, if you come to terms with the fact that this is what is happening, you want the best for
Hmm.
whatever your kid is going through. And when you have a kid with something really specific, every time you add another layer of specificity, it gets harder and harder to match them with a caregiver. And when you layer that with our systematic defunding and dismantling of mental health structures in Oklahoma. I mean, I feel like it's like ground zero for trying to see what happens when you take away mental health entirely and rely completely on the carceral system.
Absolutely. There are no options. There are
No,
zero options for us.
no.
She went inpatient a few times this year.
Hmm.
Um, but once they get past the acute and they're like, oh, she's not a danger to herself, because one of the tactics she was using, what happened was one of the tactics she was using there for a little while to distress me was to threaten to harm or unalive herself.
Hmm.
Um, which, as we finally found out, she acknowledged later that, oh no, she was just doing that too
To
to
get a
upset me.
rise.
Right.
Hmm.
So they'll take her for the acute period of time till they realize, oh, what's happening. And they're like, oh, we are not going to treat that. We won't treat her for psychopathy because she says she's not willing to do the, what is the treatment? It's not CBT. What's the other one?
PCIT, that one, or DBT?
DBT. DBT
Okay.
is the one everybody wants her to try, and she won't
Okay.
do it. She did CBT for a while. She also, when she was younger, which fortunately we were kind of lucky that she got the RAD diagnosis,
Hmm.
as opposed to some of the other misdiagnoses that happen commonly,
Hmm.
because really at that age, at 5, 6, 7, it's basically the same
That's right.
treatment as for if you're looking at
Right.
something like psychopathy. So we did
Right.
get kind of an early buy-in on, okay, my life is easier and I get more of the things I want if I follow the rules. So for the most
Right.
part, so most of like the damage that she's done and things like that, not to downplay it because it is quite expensive. I was part of a research study earlier this year where they wanted you to estimate like how much
Oh my God.
financially it costs you per year, for just things that they break and damage and you have to replace, and it's about $15,000 a year, which I don't make a lot of money. That's a lot of money.
No, and it's a resource. What you find is like a lot of scorched earth with relationships. So when I talked earlier about personality disorder, this is something that's getting in the way of your ability to connect with somebody else. If you're draining and extracting all of your primary caregivers' energies because they're constantly cleaning up your messes, what ends up happening is a parent or a support system that's completely disinterested in helping you, you know,
Oh yes, there
you
is
know.
nowhere. She's 15 now,
Hmm.
but there is nowhere else. She can't go stay anywhere else.
Hmm.
I literally can't take her anywhere,
Hmm.
because it doesn't matter, friends, family, it doesn't matter. She will steal from them. Um, in her mind,
She's
there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no,
So,
she's exhausted those
right. So
outlets
she's
already.
exhausted all of
Hmm.
those, and there's
Hmm.
just no other options on that.
Hmm.
And then,
Hmm.
of course, we are fortunate, that things it just kind of lined up the way they did, and we moved to the property that we're on.
Hmm.
So her room, she has a 1-room cabin that is her
Hmm.
room,
Hmm.
separate from the main house, which
Hmm.
she was super excited about because it makes her feel grown up to have her own room,
Sure,
right?
sure, sure.
Um, but and that was already planned that way when we started looking for the property. But as it turned out, the timing turned out to be pretty well, because that also kind of came together about the time that the safety risks to me and the threats and attempts on my life started.
Hmm.
So we were able to have a bit more security that way, because now there is always a locked door between us when we're sleeping and aren't able to necessarily, defend ourselves as effectively and things like that. That's not a privilege that most people have.
No,
Most
the
people
safety planning that you're talking about.
Right. And
Right.
so creating safety planning in a typical household is extremely hard. And
Yes.
I see parents agonizing over what else they can do, on that parent group, because you've got to protect. There are some who like to harm animals. She has
Right.
admitted now to which a long time I was suspicious way before we got the anybody mentioned the possibility of psychopathy. but there was a suspicious death of a couple of small pets. And I just said no more pets in the house.
Right.
Because I couldn't get to the bottom of what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was kind of suspicious, and I'm like, no, we're just not going to have any. But yeah, younger kids, even the adults, as they get older, you know, as teenagers get older, they're as big as us, and they can do a lot of. So.
Well, and I like you pointed to like some of the behaviors that gave you clues that were, you know, suspicious in childhood. So the flat affect, seeking stimulation, the harming of animals is definitely a cue. There can also be things like fire setting or destruction of property.
That's one of her favorites, is destruction of property.
That's
what costs me so much every year.
Yeah, fire setting is also like super common.
She hasn't, to my knowledge, done that. She has the fascination with fire.
Right.
So like when there's anything going on with fire, she is all about it. But so far, I don't think we've crossed the line into actually arson yet. Maybe, hopefully we won't get there.
Yeah, and there's like other stuff like the bullying, the torment of siblings or same age peers. Sexual offending can also occur. Like these are the, you know, the broad strokes, but even within like the things I'm listing, you can hear how varied those behaviors can be. But like when you're talking about a person with psychopathy, they've usually had like a pattern of those behaviors in childhood as well. And I really, really like how you talked about establishing safety, because I was thinking about like what permitted me to be able to enter in therapeutic relationships with, because I was working in a facility in Illinois that was like at the time 500 men who had committed sex offenses. And the proportion of, so I think we talked about 1% of the population has psychopathy, 1 to 2. Somewhere in there,
somewhere in there.
It's like less in women, like less than 1% in women, 1 to 2% in men.
Right.
And then in the prison population, it's approximately like a quarter of the population that's going to come up with psychopathy. In the place that I worked in, I'm putting an asterisk next to this because it was high even in comparison to other places like in the United States that also did civil commitment, but it was like 72%, which is a really, really high figure to have like that level of medium to high psychopathy in a facility. So some of it had to do with like the very loose way that the evaluative system was occurring, is what I've come to understand later, was that we used to say, oh, it was like 72% psychopaths in our facility, but maybe we'll see, you know, it's still a lot, you know. But what was I saying? So, yeah, anyway. So that was that high percent. Oh, I know what I was going to say.
Safety planning is where you were going.
There we go. So I have this supposed number of like this huge proportion of people with psychopathy. And even if they're not psychopaths, these are all sex offenders that I was working with, right? So what is allowing me to safely navigate these relationships and even have like gains with them? So the physical safety that we had were these structures and barriers, right? So I don't love the idea of prison, right? I'm not crazy about putting everybody behind bars. I'm not, that's not what I love, but I also really have a hard time like with knowing the things that I know how to do and not being able to provide the help to people that I know may not otherwise have access to that. Like that's really what I'm passionate about. So I had like one guy once tell me, he's like, you just love that I'm locked up in here. You love that we're locked up in here because you have a job. And I was like, look, I'd go wherever you are. Like I want you to have this treatment because it makes your life better and it decreases the likelihood that you're going to harm others. I don't care if I care that I'm able to do it. So what allows me to do that? In this particular instance, if you're not going to be the person who controls yourself to like not harm me or somebody else, then here are these external controls that are going to be happening for you. You're going to have guards. You're going to have, STAs or the security therapy aides or whatever have you in whatever facility that are going to be there to make this a safe environment so that you and I can get the work done that we need to get done. So if that means plexiglass walls, that's what we're looking at, and I feel like you kind of intuitively did that as a parent, as you said. Here is where my barriers. The other thing that I did as a clinician was they just really didn't have a lot of information about me. So I only used my last name when I was practicing. I never discussed any personal conditions, my religion, my background, no siblings. You knew I did not share those things. There are clinicians who make determinations to self-disclose, but I felt like, what's the point? Either this is going to end up being information that's used against me, either I'm going to be conned in some way,
Right.
Or I'm just making it about myself when really I'm here to like treat these guys. And the other thing is that like people with psychopathy are really very closely observing you and they are watching for blips and inconsistencies in what you say and what you do. And there's an Alfred Adler said trust only movement, and that's because they're watching, like he was referencing something else, but like I have come back to that saying a lot that I have to be accountable for myself to show up consistently every single time and say, here are the rules of engagement with me. Here are my boundaries. Like, I don't mean boundaries as a way to like punish or withhold. I'm talking about boundaries that allow us to engage safely, because if you do not have those internal controls to be able to not commit harm to me, then I have to put them in this other external way. And maybe that means you just don't know about anything about me because you're not safe to know anything about me, and maybe when you demonstrate safety, then we can renegotiate the terms of that engagement. You know what I mean? So anyway, those are some of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about, because I was like, in my practice, this is how I was able to do really good work. But like as a parent, they can't like not know about you,
Right. And you can kind of restrict some of that. Like got a little sideways with a clinician several months ago. In the last facility she was in, they called me. They wanted to do that initial meeting before they do, set up the family
intake
therapy. And she did not tell me I was on speakerphone and that my child was in the room.
Oh no.
And so I disclosed a lot of things I wouldn't normally disclose. And I told her, and when I heard her say, so what do you have to say about that? To her, I said, I'm sorry, is she in the room? Well, yes. And I'm like, okay, you should have told me that, because there was a lot of things like basically my feelings on things and the things that, bother me or different people that I would not have said if I had known she was there. And they countered with, well, she's old enough, she needs to be part of her treatment. I understand that, but you just had me hand her information to weaponize against her family members.
Yeah.
When we can simply avoid that by just not making those particular disclosures and keeping it on the surface level facts. So
the rules of engagement have to be agreed upon so that we can have safe interactions.
Right. And that
is basic.
One thing that we had, like I said, we had already planned on doing the house setup this way because, even not having the updated diagnosis, because we were trying to design things, like I said before, to fit her needs. And her needs are, we had observed from the time she was very young, that she just does better if she has a place that's hers. No one else is in it. And that gives her a place to go when she has big emotions that she can't control. She would learn, she would just go to her room, decompress, and then we could move forward. So we had already made that plan. So I do think there's something to be said for, and I don't know if this is just an American thing or if this is common in other places, but something about the authoritarian way Americans tend to parent, so that no, it will be done this way and this way only, doesn't allow for the flexibility of designing the relationship according to the needs of the child. And
it's also like, to speak to like the cultural piece for us, it's completely counterintuitive to how like how we approach children as being, we're in this collaboration. How am I going to be a parent best to you? Not, I have such fidelity to these values that I have to, emulate Betty Crocker. Like,
right.
I'm trying to be the best, bring the best you up that I can. So like what you're talking about is making this environment like super successful for like here's the best possible situation. I'm going to recognize your strengths. I'm going to recognize your needs, and I'm going to give you the things that you need. Here is your space. Here's where you can be successful. I'm not going to be punishing to you. If you have big feelings, you're allowed to have them. I feel like that's just reasonable respect, but it's also like, that is not inherently, to me, like not American to have view of children as having autonomy and being deserving of respect and not being seen as just property.
Right.
We don't see kids that way.
Right. And I think seeing kids that way and approaching it from that mindset is also part of why we have had fewer physical altercations at home, whereas like at school, there were more issues because there was the authoritarian setup of, no, you will do this because I told you to. And there was continual escalation, right? Which we thought at the time initially was, triggering trauma. But as it turns out, it was really just more of, no, I'm not going to. It doesn't matter what you do to me.
And it's not that you couldn't have psychopathy and have trauma,
but we didn't learn until later when she would actually talk about those. She's like, no, I just don't think I just don't want to do that. And it didn't matter what they did to me. I'm just not going to do it. Okay, well, there we go. But that's actually how she ended up in virtual school. We're like, okay, what is most important here? Well, what's most important is you getting the education. So we're just going to take the negativity out and, find a setup where you can get that without having the other. So, I mean, I know there's a lot of people who are highly critical of the way that I'm navigating things, but it is, we're just trying to do, every family is just trying to do the best they can with what they've got.
That's right.
It's not, there is no roadmap for parenting in general, let alone parenting with
this 1% of the population.
Right.
With no support, because even like, it's hard to find support as a parent for a typical child, let alone a child with psychopathy. It's hard to find mental health treatment for typical problems, let alone psychopathy, let alone being in a rural area, let alone being in a red state. Like, all of these things make it harder and harder and harder for us to find resources. So if you're creating these little tweaks and pieces, I think that it's obviously yielding the outcome that is best for where you are. Like, and I think kind of giving parents the benefit of the doubt is pretty important. I mean, I know there's garbage parents too, but
right. But you're just trying to do what you can. And that's the thing too, is we have to, expectations management, I think, is huge in parenting. A lot of people focus on okay, but I wanted to do all of these things and I'm only doing half of them or whatever. And so, when my kid is, making threats and ending up with police involvement and going to the facility, oh, that's the end of the world. I'm like, I mean, considering where we could be, no, this is actually a pretty relatively good outcome that we've had so far. You know,
Well,
so I think we have to be realistic about what we're working with and
oh,
realize that
yes.
those things aren't necessarily inherently bad, which I
Hmm.
think brings us back to stigma too.
Oh,
Is
yes.
that's why we think those things are bad.
Yes. And
Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And to be sure you never miss an upload, make sure you turn your notifications on. And please come join us on social media so we can continue these conversations in between episodes. You'll find us at Hypoxia Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok.